Hello and welcome back to Lady Disdain Reads. My name is Beatrice and today I have decided to make a video on the concept of duty in Jane Austen. In order to do this, I have decided to reference Professor Nicholas Boyle's book, Sacred and Secular Scriptures, A Catholic Approach to Literature. While I disagree with some of what Boyle has to say, which I will soon tell you about, I decided to engage with this particular book as I think the concept of duty in Jane Austen is very important to our understanding of her system of morality. As in my Northanger Abbey video, I will reference ideas from my first video on Jane Austen and ethics, what would Jane Austen do, or rather what would Jane do, so we'll leave that one in the description below for you to watch alongside this one. So let's get straight into this discussion now. We're going to start by looking at what Nicholas Boyle has to say about Mansfield Park, before comparing it to Alasdair MacIntyre's approach to Jane Austen. A lot of what Boyle points out is a compelling and illuminating interpretation of Austen's novel. For instance, he argues this: the church is the central theme of Mansfield Park, further adding that, as an Anglican, Austen would have seen Christ as the embodiment of God's law on earth and the church itself as God's principle made visible on earth. I find this convincing for a number of reasons. First of all, Edmund Bertram's decision to be ordained is central to the novel. It is what divides Edmund from Mary Crawford and what gives constancy and moral fibre to him as a character, even in his wavering and changing affections for Fanny and Mary Crawford. Secondly, the church and its teachings act as a moral compass and fixed point of reference for Fanny Price herself against the chaos introduced by the arrival of the Crawfords, both Mary and Henry. I also agree with Boyle when he says this: the structure of Mansfield Park is a relentless tightening of the focus on one point only, Fanny's resistance to the temptation represented by the intrusion of the Crawfords into Mansfield Park. It is her faith, Fanny's faith and her Christian principles, that indeed aid her in remaining constant to Edmund and to her values, despite adversity and despite the Crawfords' influence, and that lead her in a final decision not to marry Henry Crawford when he proposes marriage. Fanny and Edmund's marriage at the end of the novel, as well as Edmund's decision to be ordained and his going through with that decision, can be seen to represent a return to order in the novel, and a triumph of, to use Boyle's terms, God's law, God's principles, over the recklessness and disorderly behaviour of the Crawford siblings. So far, so good. But what is my qualm, or what are my qualms with Boyle? Well, my qualms are mainly about Boyle's language around the central concept of duty in Mansfield Park. While I like the fact that he talks about duty so much, I find the way he talks about it and the assumptions he makes about what Jane Austen might have meant by duty are a little bit misleading at times. So, he makes the valid point that Edmund becoming a clergyman means that he's accepting a life of what he terms daily obligation. This is all good, I agree with that. He also makes the equally valid suggestion that Fanny herself feels a sense of duty not to go against her principles, for example, as I mentioned before, in deciding not to marry Henry Crawford. But from here, Boyle's language assumes certain Kantian characteristics, which I think are unhelpful in our understanding of Jane Austen's ethical system. Now, I have a whole video planned for a few weeks from now on Austen and Kant's philosophy, where I will expand on the ideas proposed here, and I will argue that I don't think Jane Austen is a Kantian at all. But for now, let it suffice to say this for those of you who, like myself, have never formally studied philosophy at school or university and might need a bit of an introduction. So, Immanuel Kant, who was he? He was an 18th century German philosopher and a crucial Enlightenment thinker. As his life overlapped with Austen, there are some scholars who think that she might have been influenced by him or by his ideas secondhand. Now, they can't claim that she was influenced by him directly, because we have no proof that she ever read his works. However, his ideas were circulating very quickly. I believe their lives overlapped by 29 years, which was quite a long time, and she might have indeed come into contact with some of his concepts through translations of his works, or through other English thinkers who might have taken some ideas from him. Now, we know she couldn't read any German, so she definitely did not read his works directly. While Boyle does not claim at all that Jane Austen was influenced by Kant, he does speak about Kant a lot in his book. He mentions him a lot, and he's a professor of German literature, so he would be very, very familiar with Kant's thought. And it is my impression that his way of speaking about Jane Austen, especially about her idea of duty and what that means, is very Kantian. Why do I think this? Well, let's have a look at these claims made by Boyle. He thinks that being principled is what distinguishes Fanny Price from the Crawfords, which I agree with, especially since the word principle is used throughout Mansfield Park. It is a very loaded, very important word that Jane Austen references throughout the novel. However, Boyle also says this: principle is the awareness that, whatever one's motives or circumstances, life is to be lived as a duty. This sounds to me very similar to the understanding of duty laid out by Kant in his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, where he sees duty essentially as the act, the decision to do what is right, to do what is moral, regardless of one's personal inclination, feeling, circumstances, or advantage. This is the bit where Boyle is saying about principle being the awareness that whatever one's motives or circumstances, you must do your duty. So it's this idea that duty is something to be done against one's inclination, not necessarily against one's inclination, but regardless of one's inclination. It is something to be accomplished regardless of one's feelings, one's motives, of what would be most suitable for us. There is always such a thing as right and wrong, and our duty is to follow what is right regardless of how we feel about it. And that does not preclude the idea that we might feel very unhappy about it. In fact, in Kant, you find this idea that it is actually when you are very disinclined to do something, it is actually when doing what is right causes you distress, that you can best discern, that you can best see that you are doing that good thing because you think it is the right thing, and not just because it just so happens to be what you want to do anyway. He thinks that it is easier to see a person acting as a moral being if you don't want to do something and you do it nevertheless. So you might think, now that I've tried to explain this concept, that this sounds very convincing. After all, both Fanny and Edmund relinquish the chance to marry the Crawford siblings. Fanny doesn't end up marrying Henry, Edmund does not end up marrying Mary. And you might think that they do this despite their feelings. So Edmund would like to marry Mary, but decides against his feelings because he doesn't think it's right. And Fanny decides against marrying Henry, even though it could lead to great material advantage to her, as she is poorer than him and does not have a fortune, and he would be able to provide for her. But is this really true? Is this really what Jane Austen is showing our characters to do? Are they really acting against their feelings, against their wishes, against their inclination to do what is their duty, as Boyle seems to suggest, and as Kant would suggest? Well, I personally think that this is a slightly misleading and maybe a little bit limited understanding of what Austen shows to us that she means by duty in her novels. As I was saying, this Kantian conception of duty, to be a moral being is to do what is good regardless of one's feelings or inclinations. And as I was saying again, For Kant, if you act against your feelings to do your duty, it actually helps other people to discern that you're being moral, precisely because you're doing what is good in spite of feeling unhappy about it. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around it, but you can pause and rewatch this little section to see if you get my meaning. Now, interestingly, Boyle only mentions Alasdair MacIntyre once in his entire book, in the first chapter, and not at all in the chapter about Mansfield Park. Considering how influential Alasdair MacIntyre has been in moral philosophy, and considering that Boyle's project in this book is to talk about a Christian way or a Catholic way of seeing literature and reading literature, I think it's a mistake on his part not to engage with MacIntyre's thoughts on Jane Austen. In After Virtue, MacIntyre argues this, and again, you can go back and watch my first video on Jane Austen and ethics where I reference MacIntyre to understand what I'm talking about a little bit better. He argues exactly against this understanding of being virtuous that Kant has, saying instead that in the Aristotelian tradition, virtues are dispositions not only to act in particular ways, but also to feel in particular ways. To act virtuously is not, as Kant was later to think, to act against inclination. It is to act from inclination, formed by the cultivation of the virtues. For MacIntyre, moral education is just as much sentimental education, and he thinks that this is the case for Austen too. For MacIntyre, Fanny is not being virtuous because she does her duty and sticks to her principles, no matter how much distress it brings her. Rather, both she and Edmund grow to be virtuous beings because their obstacles train them to learn how to feel in such a way that is according to their duty. MacIntyre, as we know, sees Austen as an Aristotelian rather than a Kantian thinker, and so his understanding of duty is drastically different. If we follow MacIntyre's perspective, we can see that Fanny Price is not the perfectly virtuous, principled heroine that Boyle, as many other scholars of Jane Austen, would have her be, but rather is a character who crucially experiences a moral and sentimental education as much as any other Austen heroine, learning to match her feelings and inclinations to her moral actions in an Aristotelian and Christian way. Now, let me stop there for today. I do want to justify my take on this. I do want to justify why I think this and why I agree with MacIntyre more than with Boyle, but I don't want to make this video too long. So I'll stop for now, and in a few weeks' time, I will make another video on why Jane Austen is an Aristotelian rather than a Kantian thinker. And I will mostly focus on Mansfield Park with a little bit of Sense and Sensibility for this video that I'm going to make. And I will leave you to ponder for now on whether you think that Jane Austen and her idea of duty sounds more similar to Kant or more similar to Aristotle, as MacIntyre thinks. I will leave you to ponder whether you agree with Boyle or MacIntyre more. And I guess you'll find out why I think that MacIntyre is right in saying that Jane Austen is an Aristotelian rather than a Kantian in a few weeks' time when I upload this upcoming video. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. Don't forget to check out my video on Jane Austen and ethics, the first one I made, and see you soon. Bye!